Great.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Good evening. Welcome to tonight's edition of the TIES webinar series. My name is Bertha Vasquez, and I'm the director of the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. We call it TIES for short. I'm also a science teacher in Miami, Florida. For those of you who are new to our TIES online workshops, where we invite experts to discuss important evolution topics, let me just let you know that TIES is a project of the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. We are a network of science teachers who help other science teachers teach evolution in an engaging and meaningful way. Today we have Dr. Mark Reimers, who will teach us about the evolution of the human brain. This is session 2. Session 1 is already on the TIES webpage. Dr. Reimers works as a computational neuroscientist and bioinformatician at Michigan State University. He studies brain function by applying advanced statistical and computational methods to very large data sets of brain activity and gene measures. He has been a co-author on several papers about brain evolution. Dr. Reimers has worked at the U.S. National Institutes of Health, the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, and at the Virginia Institute for Psychiatric and Behavioral Genetics in Richmond. Please feel free to ask questions in the Ask a Question section below, and we will periodically stop the presentation so I could ask Dr. Reimers your questions. Thank you so much for presenting for us today, Dr. Reimers.
Thank you, Bertha. And this is really one of my favorite topics because, as we'll start in just a second, oops, sorry, I prematurely started there. Let's get this, I should share screen. And are we sharing it?
Not yet.
Yes.
There we go.
Okay, so part of the reason that this is one of my favorite presentations is because we're asking fundamental questions about human nature. And I just want to review the sort of first slide from the first part of the talk. We're trying to understand what makes human brains work differently. Why are we, as a species, able to build large buildings, build jetliners, build ocean liners, and change the world so much? Is there some sort of special thing about our brains, either a new kind of cell or a special circuit? And as we saw last time, there really aren't any new kinds of cell types, and there don't seem to be any brand new circuits, but there's differences in the way the circuitry is put together, and that's what we'll talk about today. So I'm going to start with a bit of a detour that may seem not quite relevant at first, but it is very relevant. So you may recall that the very first difference between our ancestors and the ancestors of the chimpanzees was that we started walking on 2 legs. And our brains didn't change suddenly. In fact, there was just a report that Lucy's brain was pretty much like an ape's brain, but she was able to walk on 2 legs. And there's a number of reasons for this, which we don't need to get into right now. But there was strong selective pressure for standing upright and then walking. And of course, now we've ended up back on the far right. I spend most of my days hunched over a computer screen. But walking upright changes something else, and that is our hips. So on the left, you can see on the top left, the pelvis of the fossil Australopithecus afarensis, so that's the Lucy fossil. On the bottom left, you see a modern human pelvis. And compared to that, on the right, you see a chimpanzee pelvis. There's no mistaking the difference. And the important point that I want to draw is not so much about walking, but about the birth canal. Human babies have a much harder time being born than chimpanzee babies. And that makes a lot of difference for our brains. So in particular, I want to talk about why human children are so much more impressionable than ape children. And we'll talk about what that means. And this all comes back, and this stems from the problem of getting a big head into or out from a small space. Now, you recall that from last time that our brains are about twice as big as a primate of our size, height, and weight should have. And so at the same time as human beings have been walking upright and flattening their pelvises, they're also trying to, they're also under selective pressure for bigger heads. So how do you manage these contradictory selective pressures? You should, in order to walk upright, we should be giving birth to smaller headed babies, but there's such a selective advantage in the complex social world to having a big head that we want to do both. So how do we square the circle? Well, what evolution did was a typical sort of a end run dodge. So instead of a substantial change to the design of the brain, human infants are just born at a less mature stage. So whereas chimp infants are born with their heads more than half of their full size, human beings are born with heads only about a quarter of their full size. So, so there's much more brain expansion in human childhood than in ape childhood. Now let's look at what that means for the neurons. So what is actually in that big volume of brain tissue you have? You actually don't get any more new cells as your brain expands. You're pretty much born with almost all the cells you're ever going to have, or at least almost all the neurons. But what really swells the volume is the synapses between the cells. And so in this picture, and I'm just going to hide this picture and start it again. So in this picture, you're seeing a sort of schematic of the synapses in a baby's brain on the left here, a 7-year-old's brain in the middle, and a teenager's brain on the right. And you can see that when you're born, you may have lots of cells, but you don't have very many connections. And then during early childhood, those connections fill in. In fact, they overfill. And during adolescence, a lot of those connections are pruned, but you're still left with, as an adult, many more connections than you had as an infant. So that's one of the key changes between human infancy or human childhood and ape childhood, is that we're filling in lots more of the connections between the cells during early life. And that means that the early life experiences we have shape those connections much more than they would shape the connections in an ape brain. Now, there's several different ways in which human beings delay the maturation of synapses. So there's several different genes that have changed their regulation so that we can delay the full connectivity of our brains until we've had a lot of early life experience. And so it seems that all of these different genetic mechanisms converge on the same phenomenon. And that's what really enables us to have imitation, culture, and cooperation. So I'm going to pause here for just a second. Bertha, are there any questions right now?
Yes, there are some questions. From Francesco, we have, you mentioned women's waists, and he wants to know, is it true that because of C-sections, women's waists are actually moving more towards a slimmer size due to natural selection no longer being affected by dying in childbirth?
You know, that's a good question, Francesca, and I do not know the answer.
Okay.
Probably someone who knows more about gynecology would know the answer to that, but I do not.
Yes. The other question is, walking upright also changed where the hole that the spinal cord comes into the skull, right?
Yes,
so,
that's right.
That moved it more towards the front. So that's more like a statement you've got there.
Yeah, that's certainly true. There are lots of other changes that have happened that I'm not spending a lot of time on.
Okay, those were the two. So.
Okay, good. Well, then let's go on to imitation and how that's important for the formation of human culture and cooperation. So first of all, I think most of you have heard of so-called mirror neurons. These are not a special kind of neuron. Most of us really dislike this term. It implies that there's a sort of special kind of neuron that is different from other kinds of neurons. But rather, it's the case that in monkeys and in human beings and in many primates, there are some neurons that seem to be active both when you are doing an action and also when you watch someone else doing an action. So this is a sort of schematic, or actually it's a recording on the right and a schematic on the left of this monkey who's picking up an object that looks sort of like a rock or a shell, and that's a recording of one neuron in the motor cortex of that monkey's brain on the top right. And you can see that, you know, in the half second when he's making the reach, that neuron is firing a lot. But what's remarkable is that that same neuron also fires around the time that the man makes a reach for that same rock. So there's some way of recognizing that the organization of those two actions is the same. And we don't really know how that is, but it's certainly something that's taken over a larger part of our brain. So when we talk about mirror neurons or mirror response, we have a mirror response in many more parts of our brain than a monkey does. So that you can find areas of our brain that respond both to us doing an action or are active while we're doing an action, and they respond when we watch someone else doing an action. And that, I think, leads to a peculiarity of human beings. So how many of you have heard the phrase monkey see, monkey do? Well, actually, monkeys are not really that compulsive about imitating other monkeys. They do it, and we make fun of them for it, but they don't usually copy other monkeys' styles. If a monkey, you know, if one monkey's eating a good food, another monkey will come and try to grab some of the same food, but they don't do what this child is doing. This earnest French child is, you know, trying to imitate presumably his father and another man as they're walking down the street. So, you know, apes will figure how to do something by watching, but they'll do it on their own terms, whereas human children will imitate just about everything, including lots of irrelevant actions. And I'm going to show you a video in just a minute that involves this sort of puzzle box. So basically, the aim of what they're trying to do is to get a treat that's held inside the box, but there's lots of other, you know, gadgets around the box. So let me show you what happens when you show a human child how to open that box. So here the experimenter is showing the child what to do. Now finally the box is open. And there is a treat, little gummy bear. Okay. So this kid's got it down. He knows all the magic actions that will induce the box to open, right? And there it is. Okay, very good. So he's copied exactly what he was told to do. Now, what do you think would happen if you do the same thing with a chimpanzee? Just think about that for a minute. And this has been done. And if you look at the video there, the longer part of the video, you'll see what they've done showing a chimpanzee how to do this. Well, the chimpanzee doesn't bother with any of the fluff, doesn't tap it or remove the stick at the top or do anything else. It just goes right to the business end. Just pulls this right up to the side and grabs the treat. So a chimpanzee doesn't care how other people do things or how they just want to know what works. But we care as human beings about, how other people do things. And, in a way that's less efficient, but what that enables us to do is to cooperate at solving complex tasks. So the reason we can, build bridges and build buildings and do all kinds of other things starts from our ability to cooperate in everyday tasks like these boys are sharing a bird that they have caught. So let me stop there for just a second and take any other questions. Bertha, is there anything else that's come up?
Well, it's funny because the question was, can a chimp do the thing with the box? But then you answered the question.
Okay.
We're good.
Good, okay. Well, then let's change focus a little bit to attention. So one of the things that distinguishes human beings from apes is that we can sit down and concentrate and do some work. We can also share attention with other people. We can concentrate and cooperate by both looking at the same thing. And it turns out that apes don't do this very much at all. So we're used to these sorts of scenarios where a mother may show her child how to do some motor task, or where these three young adults are staring at a computer screen and presumably working on something together. So human children generally learn by participating in group activities much more than ape or monkey children do. Generally speaking, monkeys aren't even interested where other monkeys are looking unless they think they have found something that they might want to grab for themselves. Chimpanzees occasionally do pay some attention, but generally less than human children. And one of the distinctive things that was only discovered about 20 years ago is a gesture that we take for granted, that when we want to get somebody to look at something interesting, whether that's a sunset or a bird, we can point. But most primates don't point, and they don't understand when a human points that indicates where there's something interesting to look at. So this ability to share attention is critical for our ability to learn from each other. And at the same time, the ability to sort of sustain our efforts and sustain attention seems to be unique to human beings. And one of our papers suggested that this may have to do with an increase in dopamine synthesis in many parts of the brain that are important for sort of remembering what you're doing and remembering how you're feeling about it. So here we have a comparison. It's a bit of a complex picture, but basically what we're looking at is the level of dopamine synthesis in different areas of the brain. and each color represents one species. So we are in red, chimps are in blue, and monkeys are in green. And you can see that for many areas of the cortex, yeah, we have a bit more, but not astonishingly more. But in the hippocampus, amygdala, and striatum, which are areas crucial for sort of forming habits, especially emotional habits or motivational habits, we have vastly more. And dopamine seems to be important for perseveration, for maintaining interest in or motivation for a particular task. And if you if you're addicted to something, it often is manifest in secreting a lot of dopamine in the presence of that addictive item. So this big change in human beings seems to enable us to sort of sustain effort from memory, not from an immediate reward. Very few apes and monkeys will work at a boring job in order to get a paycheck at the end of the week, whereas human beings do that on a regular basis. And that we think that that has a lot to do with this increase in dopamine. Any questions on that, Bertha?
The one question you have now is, do any other animals follow pointing? Like pointing to teach something?
Yes. So interestingly enough, domesticated dogs will do that sometimes, but wolves will not. So something has happened in the past, 30,000 years of human selection for dogs, because of course, basically dogs descended from wolves, and we selected them, or we evolved them to our liking, and we evolved them to at least pay attention to us socially in a way that like other people do.
Yeah,
So
I saw that in Nova Dogs Decoded. It's a documentary about dog research, and they show that in that documentary.
Yeah. Okay, now a question that many people have is, are we still evolving? There's lots of parts of that question, but I'll try to address, are our brains still evolving? So, of course, evolution doesn't typically happen in 1 or 2 generations. So we can't say, we're evolving relative to our parents or our grandparents. But we can say something about evolution in the past, 100,000 years, or maybe 3,000 generations. And one of the most striking things is, while we like to tell the story about how big our brains are, in fact, Homo sapiens brains have shrunk by about 10% in the past 50,000 years. So you may recall that I told you last time that Neanderthals had much bigger brains than we did. Even so, our brains have shrunk by 10%. So our ancestors in 50,000 BC would have had substantially bigger brains than we do. There's lots of reasons why that might have happened, which we can get into if you're interested. Another thing is, you've probably heard about Alzheimer's disease and the genetic variants in ApoE that we call risk variants. Well, it turns out that the risk variant is the ancestral variant. That's the variant that all the apes and monkeys have. But the variant that protects against Alzheimer's seems to have originated in the last 100,000 years and spread very widely. So lots of people, in fact, majority of people, have a variant that is not the risk variant for Alzheimer's. So why would it matter? This was a puzzle for a while, because it was thought that, well, people who are parents don't get Alzheimer's, so why, you would only get it long after you've reproduced. So normally those things don't affect selective pressure. But in fact, we think that grandparents and sort of stories around the campfire became increasingly important in the past few 100,000 years. And we know today that in traditional societies, children with living grandparents, living and cognitively competent grandparents, do better than kids who do not have active grandparents. So there has been some selective pressure for these variants that protect against Alzheimer's disease. Another variant that you've probably heard about, and probably some of you have had personal experience with, is there's a variant of dopamine receptor D4 that is often associated with attention deficit disorder. And it's interesting because that variant has been selected for, meaning that the ancestral form is not the so-called risk variant, but in the group of human beings who left Africa about 50,000 years ago, that variant is very common. So it seems to have actually conferred some advantage to them. We're still discussing and debating about what advantage that might have been, but a number of studies suggest that this particular variant doesn't necessarily always work to impair cognitive function. Under some circumstances, it seems to work to enhance cognitive function, particularly in certain kinds of close environments, close social environments. So it's certainly been selected for. What about some other genes? So we have evidence of selective pressure in the last few thousand years in a number of other genes. When I say few thousand, I mean the last 10, 20, or 30,000 years. So one of the interesting genes has the odd name of Gephyrin, and that is actually a protein that sort of acts as a scaffold, and it scaffolds all of the inhibitory synapses in your brain. And it turns out that people in East Asia and people in Europe have completely different variants of this gene. And somehow they've been selected, both have been strongly selected, but in opposite directions. Another gene that affects behavior is the oxytocin receptor. I think you've probably heard of oxytocin in relationship to sort of fellow feeling and affinity for people, so-called the love hormone. Well, there are a number of variants of this gene, and some of them have been shown to be related to empathy. But oddly enough, in the last 10,000 years, the variant related to empathy seems to be decreasing, which suggests that there's selective pressure against that. That'll let you think about what might have been going on in the last 10,000 years. And then, of course, most embarrassing, well, now we have some evidence about the genetics of IQ. And again, the genes don't tell even half the story. They're a relatively small part of the story, but insofar as we can measure it, the genetic variants associated with higher IQ seem to be being selected against in the United States. So let's ask how we might evolve in the future. So overall, we can see that there's been rapid evolution in lots of genes in the last 10,000 years. And some of those are genes affecting brain function. You might ask, well, given how much emphasis there is on multitasking and interconnectedness in the modern world, will there be evolutionary pressure for this kind of multitasking? That's anybody's guess. I don't know. I'm not sure anybody does know. Another thing we might think about, which is already moving from science fiction to experimental medical practice, is supposing we identify a gene variant that confers some sort of disease risk. Should we employ genetic engineering to remove that allele from the person, or perhaps even from their germline, so that from their descendants? And this is a sort of trope of science fiction, and may may in fact be possible. It may be possible even to confer desired characteristics. I think that this is at the moment a bit of a dangerous idea because we are just beginning to understand how genes affect the properties of the mind, and it's certainly not very simple. So I would not bet on this for the next couple of decades. But in the long run, who knows? So should we modify those genes? That's a question to think about, and that some of you may end up having to think about in the next 50 years. So I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of recommendations for reading. So a good general book on the brain is The Lives of the Brain. Another very good book on the brain that I forgot to put in here was Behave by Robert Sapolsky, but I mentioned that in the last lecture. A book that I think doesn't get enough credit, but really is important, is The Evolution of Childhood, looking at how childhood has changed over the last few million years and how important that is for human society. And then this is one of the earlier books. It's a little bit out of date and not quite as topical anymore, but looking at how the invention of culture and the invention of civilization in 10,000 years ago has changed the selective pressures on human brain genes. And with that, I'm going to end, and I'll stop sharing screen and bring us back.
Hi. Okay.
Hi,
we have a few questions now. Going back to when you started back after the last question section, any idea about Neanderthal cognitive abilities? Considering they had a bigger brain, does that mean anything at all, or is it all about the connections?
Yeah, that's a question lots of scientists are asking right now. We've certainly got evidence that so remember, Neanderthals were in Europe long before our ancestors were in Europe, and they were making a good living in Europe long before our ancestors got there. Now, obviously, our ancestors had some advantage, and we're still debating about what that advantage might have been. But they led a very sophisticated life. In fact, there was just an article in Science magazine documenting how 100,000 BC, Neanderthals were having a sort of complex hunting, gathering, fishing lifestyle on the coast of Portugal. And no human beings, none of our ancestors. I mean, I guess Neanderthals were human beings, but none of our Homo sapiens ancestors were, even out of, into Europe at that point, much less making a good living on the coast, on the Atlantic coast. So I suspect that they were smart in some ways. Obviously, they weren't as successful, but we still don't quite know why.
Any idea about their language abilities? Verbal, oral ability?
Well, yes, so they did have the same variant or the same highly evolved form of the FOXP2 gene that we do, that is important for clear enunciation and for sort of fine speech discriminations.
Interesting.
Their larynxes were a little different, so they probably couldn't have. They might have had trouble with some of our vowels like E, but they probably could have spoken most of words that didn't emphasize that. We of course, language doesn't fossilize. They certainly didn't have any writing. So we don't know really whether they had, or what kind of language they had. I suspect that they did have some kind of language, but how sophisticated it was, I really have no idea.
Well, so you got this question twice. Why do you think our brains shrunk?
Aha, yes, that's a $50 million question, isn't it? So there's no real agreement on this. So I can tell you what I think, but this is not the official opinion. So one of, let's think back 50,000 years ago. You're making a living hunting and gathering. You have to know a lot about animals. You have to know a lot about where plants are, what plants are good to eat, when they're good to eat, when they're going to be in fruit, how to tell, where to dig. If you're going to track animals, you have to know what all the different hoof prints, what their footprints look like, how to, identify an animal that's weak or sick when they're just grazing. You have to be really sharp. Now, if we go back, 8,000 years, what do you have to do to survive? Well, you have to get up in the morning and you have to plant your crops and you have to work hard under the sun all day. And you have to do what you're told because, the king will make life very unpleasant for you and your family if you don't. So there's only two things you have to know in the last, 10,000 years. But 50,000 years ago, you had to know an awful lot of stuff. And that's my opinion. There are a lot of scientists who would disagree with me.
In the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, it talks about how in some populations we select for higher IQ. People need to be more savvy. In the American population, it's resistance to disease is what we're passing on more. I don't know if that has any.
Yeah, Jared Diamond, the point was not so specifically the American population, but much of the so-called civilized world for the past 10,000 years has been ravaged by recurrent plagues and diseases. And so the most potent selective force in our evolution in the last 10,000 years has been for resistance to disease.
I see. We got a funny comment. Why we're not as smart as we used to be is because no one likes a smart aleck, but that's not really a question. So what is the pressure then? So that kind of correlates with this. The drop in IQ might have to do with what you just explained. The fact that you don't have to be aware of so many things as our ancestors had to be 50,000 years ago, or is a drop in IQ more recent?
Well, the study that I mentioned, which showed that the genes or the gene variants that have been that seem to be associated with IQ seem to be slightly selected against in American history in the past 200 years. So that's certainly disturbing, but it's not. The effect size is relatively small. It might be one IQ point or two IQ points. In fact, if you know some history of psychology, you would know that the IQ scores, especially the symbolic scores, the Raven's matrices and others, have been steadily increasing over the last century from about 1900, when was the first IQ test? I think the Binet test was 1905, but for about the past century. But that's certainly nothing to do with our genes. That's due to the fact that many more people are reading and engaging in the kinds of activities that are tested by IQ tests. On the other hand, in the last 20 years, IQ scores have been falling.
Sorry?
IQ scores have been falling around the world. And this, again, why? Who knows? I don't think there's no scientific consensus on it. I'm not even sure I have a good guess. So I'll just let that out there. But it's certainly
testing more people, a wider variety of people. I don't know.
Yeah, that could be partly an ascertainment artifact, but if we look at Army IQ scores, where they're just basically testing everybody.
Right. Yeah, that should be constant.
That's a good question. I have hunches about what it might be, but I really don't know.
So here's a question about the empathy, the decrease in empathy. Does it have to do with the fact that about 10,000 years ago, you had larger populations, larger scale societies? you were in a small knit group of like closely related individuals?
Well, that's a good question. And in fact, that's what I think. That's not, again, a universal or consensus among scientists. But, if you think about, 50,000 BC or 100,000 BC, you have to be someone can trust. You're living in small bands. If you're going to get into a good band, you have to show yourself to be a capable person and a trustworthy person. Those two things. They don't want someone who can't do things, but they also don't want someone who's going to turn on them or grab all the biggest, the biggest pieces of meat. They want someone who's going to share. And so I think that for most of our evolutionary history, there's been a selective pressure for that, for that kind of good character. But in the last 10,000 years, as we've settled down and as, bullies and politicians and tyrants have been able to take over larger and larger swaths of land, there's been an advantage to being psychopathic, or at least more of an advantage to being sort of Machiavellian and cruel and calculating, so long as you don't be so obvious about it.
Right.
And I think we can all think of examples like that.
Yes. Yes. Well, that was the last question. If anybody has anything else, we can wrap this up. I'll give you guys a few seconds to see if you have anything else. But I learned quite a bit. I downloaded that book, Behave, by the way, that you were mentioning last time.
Yeah, I'm just going to put that in the chat again. Yeah. So if you're on the chat, yeah, that's really probably the best book, and I really should have included it in my list. Okay.
Well, thank you so much. That was illuminating for me, and I'm sure everybody else.
Okay, great. Then thank you, Bertha, and we'll, and if you have any other questions, send them to Bertha, and I hope some of you will become scientists, and I may see you at a conference someday.
Yes, Dr. Michael. Bye, everybody. Good night.
Bye-bye.